Welcome, fellow adventurers, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today we have the pleasure of delving into the art of weaving story into live-action spaces with the multi-talented Vince Caso. You may recognize Vince from his iconic role as Bladezz on the beloved web series The Guild, but his talents span a variety of media. As an actor, writer, streamer, voice actor, and seasoned game master, Vince brings a wealth of experience to the table. And with his extensive background in running and playing games on livestream, Vince offers a unique insight into the intersection of storytelling and live performance. So, Vince, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Me too, man. Before we dive into today's topic, why don't you introduce yourself? I mean, lots of us know who you are. Some of us, fell in love with the Bladezz character, so we've known you for a while. But hey, how did you fall in love in gaming? Where did that start? And then how did you go through the process of getting to where you are today?
Yeah, well, so to kind of sum up, I'm Vince Caso. Hi, I'm an actor, writer, role player, best known for playing Bladezz on Felicia Day's The Guild some time back. I've been in a number of other various live action, voiceover roles as well. And in addition to that, much more recently, I got involved in the TTRPG space, the actual play space, and started DMing rather quickly, most notably for two shows, Failed Save and Bane's Break on Pixel Circus. And kind of the way to answer the origin story question, the way that I got involved in all of this is I had been working at Geek and Sundry, Felicia Day's company at the time, for quite some time, doing all of their various live programming, Game Engine, Gather Your Party on Fridays, a bunch of shows over there with Erika Ishii and a whole bunch of fun people. And so I'd always been in the orbit of D&D for years. And I'd had so many friends telling me, oh, you've got to play. And I just hadn't gotten around to it. I certainly had no distaste, no pullback from it, but I never really found the right group or had the upbringing like a lot of friends of mine I know who grew up in the 80s when D&D was first up and coming, where it was just ingrained into your childhood. I was introduced to it for the first time in my 20s. But eventually I did find a group. Actually, my first ever DM was, I had two literally within a day of each other. So I count them both as my first, if you can have two. But Jake Michaels, who was the director of a show that we shot at Geek and Sundry called We're Alive Frontier. Very, very fun show.
Yep.
He and Kelly Lynn D'Angelo both DM'd my first couple of games of D&D, both home games. One at my place, one at Kelly's house. And I had so little idea what I was doing, but just leaned into essentially the improv chops. My focus was always just, okay, well, I'll figure out the mechanics as I go. Let's just dive into the role play and treat this as a fun improv exercise. And thankfully, I was playing mostly with other, actors, improvs, comedians, stuff like that. So we all got to have a lot of fun doing that. But then as I played, I realized I enjoy playing the game. I do like the mechanics. I like how this plays. I think where I'm at is I need to go into DMing because I was already very much in the storyteller mindset. I'm all about writing, all about crafting worlds. And so that's what then attracted me. And then everything spun off from there.
Very cool. You said something that kind of tweaked something in my brain.
Yeah.
Improv comes up a lot when you're talking to video game writers, you're talking to DMs, you're talking to tabletop role-playing game designers. And somebody who came originally from the improv and then worked your way into the gaming space and has somebody who's played at different systems. Have you found that certain systems lean themselves better to improv?
Oh, certainly. I think there's room for it in pretty much every game system I've played. But for me, there's two ways to look at it. Are we playing I'll use this term, but I also, when I say, I'll explain. Here we go. Are we playing a high drama or a low drama game system? And by that, I mean, this also includes comedy. More are we playing a high interaction, high role play system or a low role play system? And so an example of that for me is this is also why I love 10 Candles so much, is because 10 Candles is mechanically very straightforward. The story is really told in the interactions and how much you can ratchet up the intensity of how you get through this plot. And then are we playing a high mechanics or low mechanics system? And these two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, nor are they the other side of each other's coins.
Right.
So another system that I've enjoyed is Fate Accelerated or Roll for Shoes or stuff like that, where the mechanics are so simplistic to be almost non-existent. And so you can make up not just the role play, but you can make up the way, you can invent the way, improv the way that your character engages with the mechanics as you play. And I've had so many fun games in those and other of the simpler systems where we'll just invent rules, invent mechanics, invent twists on the hack on the fly because there's room for it, and we all enjoy doing that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for it. And then for me, the middle ground, a great middle ground is D&D, where you can, at the DM's discretion, employ a mechanics heavy or mechanics light interpretation of the rules. And you can ratchet up role play, or you can let the roles do the talking with the dice if you want. And I've had that with my players too, where I've had players who are not comfortable with like the improv comedy or really intense, like deep role play. And I'm like, fine. If you want to make a persuasion check, you can also just let the dice speak for you if you prefer that. As long as you roll well on that, we all know you did a good job. If you can give me like a vague idea of how you accomplished that, that's also okay. If you are a mechanical player, you're still welcome at the table. There's no like exclusivity or niche or clique rather to it. We all play differently, and as long as we all are able to extract the same amount of joy from the game that we're playing, then we're all in the right place.
Amen. I love that. And that is the beautiful thing about D&D, is it can be almost anything to almost everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the one that comes to mind for me when I think of something that's really rules light but leans heavily into atmosphere and role playing, I think the time that I watched Ivan Van Norman run Dread on YouTube. Like, there's one mechanic and the game is incredible. But on the other side, I can remember as a kid playing GURPS and Riffs. Have you ever played any of those really rules heavy ones?
I have not, no.
Oh. Yeah, completely different experience.
Well, even like, because I've dug a little bit into the older, the more arcane forms of D&D, and just seeing how those were mechanically run, because really, in its inception, we're looking at a combat sim, a war sim in one way or another, dungeon delving combat sim, which was not really intended from the very outset to be a whole lot else, and then grew from there. And so seeing how crunchy some of the mechanics are in various iterations blew my mind, because I've been spoiled, I think, with the very kind of loosey-goosey improv, not just culture around D&D right now, but also just the forgiving nature of 5e as a system.
Yeah, 100%. As somebody who grew up on second edition, you're spoiled. Okay, so taking from your diverse background in writing and acting and gaming, I'm curious, let's get this party started. How do you approach weaving stories into these live action spaces that is different in your experience from, say, tabletop or board games or video games, or like what is unique about the storytelling technique in these live play spaces?
For sure, yeah. Well, I think I can speak for most DMs when I say that the primary dividing line between all of these various media forms is when you're playing a video game, when you're reading a book, watching a movie, you're engaging with a story being largely directed at you. Of course, when you're playing a video game, you do have varying degrees of agency depending on the genre and style of game you're playing. But with a role-playing game, you are very much merely a collaborator. This is a writer's room at this table. And while you may dictate the essential skeleton of the world, and you are focusing the plot in a direction as the sort of the end-all arbiter of these things, you cannot account, unless you run a very railroady table, you cannot account. And we've all been there. We've all seen. Yeah, absolutely. But you can't account for the ways in which your players will influence this world. And so you're telling a collaborative story that is collaborative in a way that virtually nothing else is. And as much as people want to say, like, I've also seen these comments about like a bit of a pushback on the idea of a D&D table being so improv heavy or so comedically focused or all these things. And of course, there's no wrong way to play as long as you and your table are having a good time. But you got to realize, no matter how role play light your style is with this game, fundamentally, this is an improvisational experience. Whether it's just mechanically, the fact that you chose to attempt to persuade the castle guard to let you in was not written into the session notes necessarily. You as a player decided to accomplish your goal through that method that was not preordained by the DM. This is improv. This is your improvising solutions, just like you do in real life, because we're not given a script in reality. And for me, that's always been both the biggest challenge of tabletop and also one of its greatest strengths, because coming from a background where I'm a screenwriter, I'm an author, I'm a crafter of hard story, and then transitioning to tabletop where I'm like, I have to not be focused on the outcome that I saw, on the outcome that I thought made sense, because we are all involved in writing this right now, has been very challenging. But the stories and the ideas that happened at the table have sometimes been some of the most exciting that I never would have thought of myself. So I think I'm not sure that answers your question, but in terms of like how you weave these in, and I'm sure we can always get more into the weeds of like the technique and technology of DMing and how you craft those stories live. But it starts with that. It starts with just having a player-focused mindset where you realize that you are an enabler of story. You are not the arbiter of story.
Right. I think that's something beautiful about like what I'm doing here with the show is I get to talk to storytellers like yourself who are all across the spectrum. So I talk to novelists or comic book writers who are very strict, and this is the story and how I'm presenting it, and here's the point of view I'm forcing you through. And then on the other end, you've got video game narrative designers who are talking about how they have to collaborate with a massive team to create an experience that the player can pick up as they choose, or improv artists and comedians. So you're right, D&D and tabletop role-playing is like right in the center, and it's such a sweet way to tell stories and experience stories as they're being told. So I love
and like I mentioned earlier, D&D is also great not just because it lies kind of in that middle ground, but it's because you can pick your speed and you can choose where in the middle ground you want to be. Like you can push to one edge or the other. Whereas with a lot of other mediums, they just aren't what they are. You know, you're reading a book. The book is the book, unless it's a choose your own adventure novel. Those
are cool too.
Yeah, which is great. But, you know, if you're reading Sanderson or King or what have you, the third act of the book is not going to change depending on how you felt about the second act.
Right.
So D&D is great because you can have a rigid story, or you can have a very loosey-goosey one, or any point in between those two.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to go into the weeds with you on techniques and the stuff you mentioned there, but that's not the focus today. So we're going to keep this train rolling.
For sure.
All right. So GMing for Failed Save and playing as a player on stuff like LA by Night, which was fantastic, and Outbreak Undead, also really, really cool. How do you balance, and how do the GM and the players, how do you balance the spontaneous nature of like live streaming and everything that can happen in that space with crafting a cohesive narrative and trying to keep the story maybe not on rails, but at least heading towards a goal?
Now, that's a fascinating question with a long-ass answer, because there's a few
lots of time
there. So obviously, when I was doing my shows on Pixel Circus, Failed Save and Bane's Break, I was GMing those shows. And then for shows like, you know, whether it's one-shots on Hyper RPG, or whether it's Outbreak Undead or LA by Night or any of these others, you're appearing as a player. And your role in the show is obviously very different, player versus GM. But then the way in which you serve the story, while being different, needs to be given the same level of attention and detail. And that's why, for example, on LA by Night's a great example of this, because LA by Night was a very interesting situation for me. I did not create that character. I did not create that character's story. I was given a role like an actor to play. So I received a call one day from a producer on this show, Sax Carr, who said, hey, we need to bring somebody in on this. This is like early days. This is season, 1 or 2 or what have you. We need to bring someone in to play this like FBI agent, inquisitor type who hates vampires. Greg Demetrios, do you want to come in and give it a shot? He'll probably die in the first episode. And I'm like, okay, great. Yeah, for sure. And coming from a primarily acting-focused background, I relished the opportunity to be handed a role. And so I sat down with Jason Carl for a long conversation about this person's motives, their background, how they work, why they're here, what they're doing. And I took that, fleshed out a full backstory that never came out in the show, which breaks my heart. But It happens. Fleshed out a whole backstory, worked on an accent, a dialect, the tone of voice, the way he acts, the mannerisms, all that stuff, and played the character, did the episode, and he ended up in the ensuing appearances becoming a fan favorite. The audience really enjoyed this character, which was so much fun to see. Also, it was fun when... This is a bit of like behind the DM screen talk here, but there were a couple episodes where, for example, Greg was serving a very key plot focus, a key plot point. And so Jason came to me and he said essentially, hey, don't push this too far, but you're not going to die in this episode. Like, you're going to be okay in this episode, but don't overdo that.
Jump off a building or something.
And so I had fun because that was also the episode where I started like teasing and antagonizing another character, the Nosferatu, played by Alex Ward, who I know famously has a short temper, but I also knew that I couldn't die in this episode. So we ended up having a really funny tete-a-tete because we had that flexibility of knowing that no one is going to be forced or expected to make a dramatic decision, that we could just have a bantery moment, knowing that we're both expected to get out of that conversation alive. And so, in a way, what looks like a restriction actually took the shackles off a little bit and let us just have a bit of fun, which ended up being a very, very funny scene. But then, yeah, We're Alive Frontier, and then is the opposite of that, because We're Alive Frontier was extremely unstructured as far as narrative goes. It was very, what happens, frickin' happens. And with the expectation that players are going to die off. And when a character dies, the player is fired from the show. Like, you leave the show. Of course, I was the first to die. So, naturally. I have since then made it a habit of intentionally trying to die in every campaign and one-shot that I record since. And I've been very successful at that. Okay. But, yeah, so with that one, it was an issue of, well, we need to maintain the high stakes of this show. This is a very, very dangerous world. It takes place in the world of very famous audio drama called We're Alive. And so it's a very, very horrifying world. It's, The Walking Dead times 5. It's very dangerous, very desperate, post-apocalyptic. And there needs to be death. And so we ended up all rolling characters who were such freaking powerhouses that Ivan was having the hardest time killing us off, until eventually he managed to get me bit. And then the other players, during a break where I was in my feelings at the table, the other players conspired how they were going to euthanize me to prevent the infection from spreading. It was a really dark scene, but it was fantastic. And that's the example of where, for example, I had at the table no collaboration with the DM, because it was meant to be you know nothing going into this. It's all going to be a surprise. Now, I did help to build the world of that show with Ivan for 2 years before the actual show started. I made it very just sprawling backstory for the character, how it influences the other plot of the show, what have you, which then came in handy in season 2, where I came back as my own brother after literally losing like 40 pounds and getting ripped in the gym and shaving my hair to look like this because I had long hair as the first character, and then came back as my own older brother, which was very funny. And then the show got canceled. So, c'est la vie.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, so take those players. And actually, I want to ask you, while we're on this topic now, because obviously we were introduced by a friend, and I had not met you before this interview. What is your experience in terms of, like, as a player versus GM? Like, how do you primarily interface with the TTRPG industry?
I carry the title of Eternal DM. I'm one of those sad, mournful Eternal DMs. I have DM'd basically every week since I was 10 years old, and I just turned 49 last month. So I have been running, and I have a homebrew world that I've had since I was 13. So it's been around for 30 some years as well. So yeah. That's me. I've played sometimes, but no, I've been a DM or GM forever.
Okay, then I definitely think we'll be able to relate on this point for sure. Because then when you transition from those considerations, those story considerations, also bearing in mind, we're talking about shows. Mm-hmm. They're performances. Right. And that's why I'm discussing these things at such depth and at such detail, because that's what you think about. That's what you have to think about when you're performing for an audience. I run home games and I play in home games completely differently.
That's what I was
very casual.
Yeah.
But then, so DMing for Failed Save and Bangs Break, DMing on Pixel Circus. How do you maintain the apparent integrity of a story in an inherently collaboratively improvised environment while keeping the entertainment up for a viewing audience who is also paying for your ability to do this show? Is a fascinating question. And I'm not gonna lie, there are times when I struggled and times where I then later made fun of my struggles. Specifically, anyone listening to this who may have seen Failed Save, I don't know if I ever actually disclosed this bit of trivia before, but there was an episode in, I think it was season 2 of the first campaign, somewhere around there, called Agency. That episode's probably my... okay, by the way, also, are we allowed to curse on this thing?
Fuck yeah.
Okay, great. I've been saying freaking this whole time, so
don't do that.
Sure.
No,
okay.
Don't do that.
There's an episode called Agency in Failed Save, which is my notoriously biggest fuck up as a DM. And I think it's important that we talk about that. It was one of my greatest failures as a DM because I will discuss this without shame because I want you all to understand what not to do and how to approach a situation like this. I came up with an episode which is fundamentally, I thought, had an interesting conceit, which is all of the players were going to DM a little scene where they're basically being handed this power by an entity to take over agency, to explore a piece of their backstory as a DM, running the rest of us through it as characters from their past. A fun idea, and every one of the players gets to do that. I didn't tell them we were going to do that.
Oh.
So none of them were prepared. They all panicked. And it did not even occur to me in the moment that that's something someone would have to prepare for. But of course it is. And I love doing fun, gimmicky stuff like that at my tables. But this is where we go into the collaborative aspect of D&D. Whenever you are bringing in a feature, a device, a tool, whatever it is, that exceeds the social contract you've already established with your players, they need to be brought in to review those new terms and consent to them. Because even though something like this might seem relatively low stakes, especially at a home game, being put on the spot to that degree in front of a live audience, especially if you don't have a ton of experience DMing like some of our players had,
right,
can be very, very stressful and very challenging very suddenly. And so that's why later on in campaign 2, in the last season of the show, I did a new episode focusing on this character called the Agen Seer. And I titled the episode Agen Seer, which if you read it out phonetically can also be pronounced Agent Seer, as in more agency. And that episode made fun of the first episode where we did the exact same conceit, the exact same plan. But this time, I worked with all of them one-on-one to develop the stories they were going to tell so we could kind of do it right, do it properly this time. And for me, that kind of encapsulates, like, that's the pitfall, is you can get so wrapped up in your own head as to the story that you're telling. And it doesn't even have to come from a place of ego. It's just hyper-focus a lot of the time as well, is you're so tunnel visioned on, this is going to be so cool when this happens at the table, forgetting that it needs to be enacted by people who are choosing to do this and also have their own ideas. For the most part, once I knew, and this is the real final answer to this question, once I got to know the personalities of the people I was playing with, their likes, dislikes, how they played, how they thought, it was easier for me to craft narratives that brought the episodes to a satisfying conclusion or to a satisfying bit of plot twist or whatever, that I knew the players would arrive at naturally because I was able to guide them with a bit of carrot that they already wanted to get because of who they were, because I knew them. And that's the balance, is knowing your players and being able to intuitively, organically incentivize their play without making them feel like they're violating choices they would make that lead to conclusions that are mutually satisfying and might not be the ones you expect, is how you tie those together. But yeah, not for nothing though, it's difficult. I know professional DMs who still struggle with the live play format because you are ultimately having to cater to an audience. You're ultimately having to be entertaining. And that adds a layer of stress that is difficult to surmount sometimes.
I would imagine. And having that audience on the other side of the screen, have you seen or have you done interesting ways of engaging them, getting them to actually do something to the story or affect the players? Or
Yeah, so with Failed Save, the entire show was funded just by live audience donations week to week. And so we had all kinds of donation tiers that would influence the story in wild ways, whether they can, on the simple end, spawn funny magical items or give the players goofy superhero-esque powers that I then have to come up with those, largely on the spot if I had no time to make a list ahead of time. To even stuff like, well, it transports them to the fucking Feywild. It reverses time. Just wild crap like that. We had one where, for a certain donation amount, one of the characters would just get run over by a truck. A Ford F-150 would just come and pummel one of the characters. That one got donated for a lot. And so we had all kinds of goofy stuff like that, which it was helped by the fact that Failed Save was an absurdist comedy show. The more serious, the more dramatic a show gets, the more inherently limited I feel like you are in what kind of satisfying donation rewards you can give to a live audience, because a lot of it is stuff that, well, it makes sense in the world because it's a dramatic show, which means it could have happened on its own anyway. Whereas in the absurdist, surrealist comedy, we can make the donations anything. And a lot of them will not be things that we would have chosen to incorporate. And I'll tell you, one discipline you learn as a DM, the moment you are forced to intuitively, organically incorporate live donation rewards into a narrative you're in the middle of saying, and have that feel like it's not jarring and you don't forget to redeem any, that took time to get used to. It is so freaking difficult to do that. But rewarding, because obviously the ability to actually interact with the show made it all the more enriching and fun for the viewers, which is really what it's all about.
100%. Rolling with those punches and figuring that out as you go along, has that made you better at improv and acting? Is it gone both ways?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm of the mind that improv is one of the most core skills you could develop as an actor, even if you only ever go off the script, even if you only ever use the words that are provided to you. Your ability to think on your feet and intuit or interpret the character you're given in a unique way, or to read between the lines, is inherently improvisational. And so the more that you do that, the better you will be. And I also, I picked up this adage from Sandeep Parikh, who plays Zabu in the Guild, who I still work with today.
Nice.
That improv is vitally useful and helpful in virtually every domain of life. It doesn't matter if you're working in an office or you're DMing for a show or mopping floors. The ability to be freed from the constraints of how you are supposed to think and act and the routines and internal script that society puts in there, and to then think on your feet creatively, intuitively, and to come up with new things just in a moment, is an exceptionally useful skill to have no matter what you do. So I would, just to make a separate point, I would definitely encourage anyone who thinks that anything they do could be improved by improv, which is, in my opinion, most things, to look at classes, look at even working that into your own play. If you play a D&D or another actual play, classes can be very intimidating. Improv classes can be very scary, and I get that. I've been in them since I was like 12 years old. In the beginning, I was fucking terrified. But just finding ways to incorporate a little of that here and there to get you more comfortable with it, it helps everything.
Nice. So, you mentioned Stay Alive, Frontier. Stay Alive, Frontier. Great show. Everybody should go watch
Frontier. Yeah.
Yep. One thing that stuck in my head from that show is the set design and the props. That's the one that had the bullets, right? That you guys had bullets as part of the mechanics. I'm curious, in your opinion, what role does that physical space tell? What role does it play in enhancing the narrative, the storytelling experience? Like, we think of Critical Role's set from, like, I started watching it like 5 episodes into the first season, and now you look at today and set design today, and like I said, Stay Alive. Like, what part do you think that plays in the experience?
Yeah, so I mean, when you watch an episode of We're Alive Frontier, you can immediately see like there has been some money put into this, and it was definitely like Legendary was footing quite a bill for that show. Personally, obviously, you know, with most tabletop, we're talking about a very theater of the mind kind of experience. And this should be able to work. You should be able to translate an image, a feeling, an adventure into the mind's eye of a listener or viewer and have it really communicate even just in that way. But then bringing in the miniature sets, the set pieces, bringing in the environment that we were in, I think that really helped even just to immerse us, the players, and deliver a more organic performance because, you know, and then when you check out like season 2, which is so hard to find, I think it's on YouTube now, but when you check out season 2 and you look at like the farmhouse set where Band-Aid and Anjali's character, I forget the character's name, but Anjali Bhimani, there are characters where they were interacting for a while, and you're like, this is like it's like a freaking film set. Like, it's a beautiful set. And, you know, spoilers, but one thing that they let me do, which this is really fun for me, is one thing that I love doing when possible in a TTRPG, and I wanted to do a bit more of this during like Failed Save and Bane's Break, for example. We were limited by budgetary considerations, is in the finale of season 2 of We're Alive Frontier, I was able to come through a fucking window with like tear gas and shit. Like, it was such a cool moment. They had a window pane in the back, and I have a clip of this moment. It's probably in the episode because I think they did upload the whole season to YouTube. But we planned this thing for ages, and none of the cast knew this was going to happen. They didn't know that I was coming back. They didn't know that there was a twist at the finale. None of this. And so it was me and the prop guy behind the set. And he has like this guy was fucking legit, by the way. Like, there's something about like art directors and prop dudes where they're just like the most wild motherfuckers you've ever seen in your life. They can just do anything. And so he has like this, he's got his padded glove on, and he reaches out and just breaks the window, cracks the whole thing in. They have me in a gas mask, and I come climbing out. We throw like tear gas canisters. There's fog everywhere. And then Xander, by the way, Xander Jeanneret, who was in the show, screamed his ass at the moment the window went. It was the funniest thing.
That's great.
And then they had me stand next to Ivan, pull the mask off, and give my little line about referencing who I was. I'm, you know, Nathan Stern. I think you knew my little brother. And I'll throw his like bloody dog tags onto the table. And the season ended on that. I was so fucking proud of that twist ending. Like, the way it was executed, the impact that it had on the viewers at the time, who were sparse because this was on alpha, and the effect that it had on the players. And I know for a fact the power of that moment would not have been 20% of what it was had we not had that set to use as an organic part of the storytelling experience, where this really feels like it's happening for real. This feels like you're actually in that place in the apocalypse. It feels like a TV show set. Yeah, you know, because you've seen reveals like that at tables, you know, the twist, what have you, but it's typically just somebody sitting at the table saying something dramatic. This, a guy coming crashing through a fucking window during an actual play, it's great. I wish we could do more of that. Of course, it costs money, but like that's where I want to see actual play going, where you can really begin to incorporate more just multi-dimensional, multimedia forms of storytelling and not just have it be people at a table.
Yeah. Do you think at some point that would... How do you keep that still accessible, I guess, is the question. Would at some point, and this, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
At some point, can it go too far? Can it interfere with accessibility and the ability to play and the connection? Like, can a guy get too far down the rabbit hole of sets and set design and props? And
oh, absolutely. And I feel like, for example, We're Alive Frontier just towed that line of like investing too much in the aesthetic of the show, as opposed to just like, hey, we can get by just telling a great story and performing a great show.
The one that comes to mind for me is, did you watch, or I don't know if you were there, The Stream of Many Eyes? D&D did it.
I did not. No, I heard about it. I never saw it. No.
They went way over the top. Like, there was the tavern and everybody was there. And when you watch it, it almost felt like you were watching something, as opposed to like being like when you watch a good streamed Twitch it's like you're there almost. Whereas this felt more, there was a wall between you. It kind of got in the way. Anyways, I cut you off. You were going on.
I think, to that point, though, because it's a great point, I think the people who are doing it just about the best that I've seen so far, though, is Dimension 20. Because they have this beautiful combination of factors where fundamentally they are people traditionally at a table playing a more or less traditional actual play kind of TTRPG game. But then you bring in the miniature set pieces done to a remarkable level of detail. The minis themselves, gorgeous work. But then the way they use like the background of the set, the backdrops of the set to have images floating through, to tell part of the story, to put you in the vibe and the feeling, the music, the cutaways to like, graphics and stuff like that. Obviously, finances permitting, it's a great way to elevate the story. Is it required to tell a compelling tale? Of course not. Do you know why I know that? Because audio-only productions exist.
Right.
And they do a fucking great job. In fact, I mean, just going back to the same group, but Worlds Beyond Number has been absolutely killing it. Now, again, they are at the top end, just about the top end of what you can budgetarily accomplish in an audio-only format with custom music, with a lot of, editing, sound effects, sound design. But the thing is, that level of detail, if you're going audio only and investing a lot of time to really create a bespoke experience, that is much more approachable for the average person. To be able to do things just audioly, without having to sink a ton of money into it. Visuals cost a lot of money. Building a set is impossible for 99% of people. But sound libraries, editing tracks on fucking Audacity is approachable. And I never want people to sleep on what are thought to be unconventional formats of telling stories, which with the proliferation of Dimension 20, of Critical Role, of all these shows, people think that, video-only content or video-forward content is the main way that you make these shows. It's true, that is arguably the most popular format, but it's not, you don't have to. Mics are affordable. Basic sound editing is affordable and doable. If you want to put a show out there, do what you got to do. Like, it's okay. If you tell a great story, you will build an audience.
Amen. Preach, brother. All right. Okay, so I'm going to pull back to narrative for a second here.
Yeah.
Transitioning from acting and screenwriting, how do you apply like general narrative techniques and structure from those crafts to shaping the narrative flow of a live action game or building a game or designing an encounter? What have you learned from the one world that you apply to the other?
Yeah, let me tell you. First, I'm going to grab a pen. Because there's a few sections, there's a few areas to this. So I want us to break this down here because I think there's a lot you can learn here. Not just from me because I know a lot of stuff, but because there are ways to think about this that I think would be very, very enriching for anyone specifically. And again, hear me out. The bulk of my viewpoint here is to do with effective, immersive, and engaging DMing and putting on a show for viewers. So if you want to take my advice away just to DM your games at home, it works. That's great. It's a much lower stakes environment, of course, so don't feel the need to like incorporate everything. But if you ever want to make a show or are thinking of putting your game on stream or what have you, hear me out. There's a lot of great stuff here. And so when it comes to acting, here's the first thought. Approaching this as an actor, first of all, is one reason why I was attracted to DMing in the first place, because I loved the idea that I could play all the NPCs, like just do all the fun voices, all the silly characters. That was very attractive because as a player, I'm only one person, but as an actor, I want to be a lot of people. So that was very fun. How that informs the actual storytelling process, though, the narrative creation process, that's where I began to develop the habits of how and focusing on teeing up moments for my players that allowed them to engage in a dramatic or comedic fashion. I would look at a moment and I would say, who might be able to best engage with this moment? Who either are we making a callback to, like what moment we're making a callback to, whose story is informed by this, and being able to tee up just a little bit of, and this comes down to knowing your players as well, teeing up a moment where I know there might be a player or two at the table who are really going to latch onto that and be able to spin off a really either funny or really dramatically intense scene from a little thing that I offer them, because we're kind of on that wavelength of, I know what you're building to with your character. Let me just I'm going to toss you a lead, toss you a line, and you can take it where you want to take it. And sometimes they won't. Either they won't know what you're trying to do, or that's just not what they're interested in doing during that scene, which is totally fine. But that's an important thing to keep in mind, is you're not just DMing from the DM seat. You're DMing from the DM seat and from the player's seat. Put your mind in the head of your player and consider, what are they trying to accomplish? Mm-hmm. What are they trying to build to? What is their story? And what would I find helpful or satisfying if a DM suggested or teed this up for me to tell my story if I were that player? And begin to offer those moments. And that's where the focus really comes in, is offering moments. Whenever I'm doing my session notes, I'll include a whole bunch of just one-line pieces where I know this would be a good moment that I can tee up for a specific character's story. Mm-hmm. I don't plan a whole scene around it. I just throw them a line, and if they want to then use that to spin off a whole thing, they absolutely can. But that's, it's a collaborative story, so it's on them. Once I create the opening, they then can run with it or choose not to. You're not beholden to it. And so of all the various, because I could go obviously on TED Talk length about how all these various multi-creative disciplinary experiences inform a tabletop game. But as far as acting goes, that is the primary takeaway, is being able to not only play your character as the DM, but to actually play the player's character, to put yourself in their shoes and assume their mentality and then serve it for the entire table. And then engage in, the banter, engage in the drama in a way that will work with that player as a person and contribute to the character's story. Obviously, you have the improv rules of yes and yada yada, but of course, you must handle these things with a deft hand. Yes and doesn't mean you agree to everything all the time, right? But just, get used to it. And then from the writing perspective, this was the trickiest bit for me, because obviously, coming from because I also, I write prose, I write screenplays, I write a lot of other stuff, and I'm used to very rigid story structures. This is the story. This is the plot. It just works this way. It doesn't matter what the characters in it think. I made them up. They're mine. So it's all flowing along based on how I think it should. I immediately had to disabuse myself of that thought, obviously, when getting into an actual play table. But the experiences writing and the understanding of the underlying principles of how you craft narrative, how you craft story, did massively contribute to my ability to build my homebrew world and to craft the overarching major narratives and histories of this place, which then informed the richness and lived-in quality of the world as we played in it. And so that's where I kind of put my focus, is yes, I will craft narratives for the individual episodes and the arcs, because the game does need a story that I can lead the players down. And especially, I'll have a very brief tangent here. If you are DMing a comedy-forward show, remember that for a lot of players, thinking comedically, being in a comedic mindset, takes up a lot of brain space. When you're looking for the next bit, the next joke, trying to entertain an audience with laughs, their minds will often be very singularly focused on that performance, that aspect. So they will not always be paying as much attention to, let's think through these plot hooks. Let's go find the next leg of the story. You might have to lead them a little bit more than you're used to. Mm-hmm. For example, like in Failed Save, that's largely what I did, is there was a lot more shepherding going on, because I knew the cast was so focused on maintaining the integrity of the level of comedy that we're going after. They're not as focused on forwarding story. So I come in to help with that. I make the plot hook very obvious. I make the next option very obvious. So if they want, obviously they can go somewhere else, but if they want to keep it easy on them, they can just go toward the shiny thing and keep being funny along the way. And that's honestly a perfectly valid way of doing it. But yeah, as a writer, it mostly came into world building, characterization of NPCs, and figuring out, intuitively, what is a satisfying arc, not just for this world and the story, but for every one of the characters. What is each one of their stories, and how should it culminate? What would be satisfying, not just for the player, but for the audience, for that person's story to end? Because the show does have to eventually come to a close. Yeah. And how will that pay off well? And being able to incorporate those things. I mean, I think you can see my bookshelf a little bit here in the sides. Yeah. The number of books I have just on writing, on process, on crafting narrative, and all these things, which, by the way, if you do want to be a writer, don't get too hyper-fixated on studying books about writing. They only take you so far. I read them primarily because I like seeing other people's viewpoints on the subject, but the best way you can become a better writer or crafter of stories is to engage more with good stories and to craft more of your own. Stephen King says, read a lot, write a lot. And that's really what it comes down to. You know, I'm working through the entire corpus of Cormac McCarthy, Moby Dick, Virginia Woolf, all of the various literary classics in the Western canon to get an idea of, you know, what makes good story, what makes good character. And then also watching the way that very, very talented people engage with actual play stories to see, okay, well, how does somebody at the top of their game do this? What is excellence? And how can I incorporate those things into a way that I both play and DM? And over time, you will get that screen time, you will get that experience, and you'll find you start intuitively incorporating that kind of just really well-grooved in, well-driven and experienced high-quality play, banter, drama, pathos into your play as well. And that's a deeper answer perhaps than we were looking for, but no, that's the most surface level that I can do it without talking for another 2 hours on the subject.
I find that every single time I interview somebody, I'm like, okay, we're going to have to do another interview about that. So there's that moment. You're coming back to talk about that.
Hell yeah.
Dude, you're hella smart. I love this. It's fantastic.
Oh, you're very kind.
You mentioned world building. You are an accomplished world builder. I'm thinking Boros, yes?
Yeah, Boros.
Boros.
Yeah.
So before we move out of this whole thing, I want to, because world building is probably my biggest kink. It's my passion. I'm completely obsessed with world building. So I'm curious, obviously, what are some of your approaches? How do you come at are you a macro or are you a micro? How do you attack world building?
Yeah, that's a fun question. It's also tricky because, you know, at this point I've been building the world, I want to say so long, but you established you've been building yours since you were 13, I believe is what you said.
Yeah.
So less time than
36 years. Yeah.
So I've been working and developing this world pretty intensively since about 2017, 2018, and obviously flushed it out more as I built it for the purposes of these shows as well. But the world started as a world that I constructed for a home game, which is also how all of these shows started. We just had a group of five people over to my house, and we had a little adventure. My first time ever DMing in a world that I was really coming up with largely on the fly, but had done a good deal of. I'm very obsessive, so I'd hand drawn the entire map. I'd worked out most of like the skeleton of a 10,000 year past history, various cultures, named all the places, yada yada, all like the intensive stuff like that. But then over time, though, I continued fleshing it out because now, we're making shows. We're making this, making that. I want to have more going on here that it feels rich. It feels lived in, feels natural. But in terms of the overall approach, I think I'll say how I do it. There's no right or wrong way to approach this. Because I've noticed it's very, very common for a lot of world builders to take it from a sort of a small to a big, a micro to a macro, where they'll just create a city, or they'll create a coast, or they'll create a single area where most of the play takes place and then expand from there as needed. That's fantastic, and probably, honestly, a much more straightforward way of doing it and a much less stressful way of doing it. Unfortunately, tragically, I'm not capable of it. If I build the world, I'm building all of it at once. And so for me, it was, okay, I know what the basic plot of this story is. And this was the show that became Bane's Break. I wrote the entire plot of Bane's Break back in 2018 as the plot of my home game, which we then later adapted into the first season of this show. And the essential conceit was very simple. It was, hey, so there's this legend in popular culture in this world of a group of heroes who defeated a great tyrant in years past, and our heroes are at a festival to commemorate their victory, but also their death on like the 400th anniversary of that event having taken place, when they are whipped back in time, and you find out they were the heroes all along, who are now being given a second chance to do it right, because the first time through, they really did fuck up and left the world kind of in a worse place than it was before in a lot of ways.
That's cool.
And so basic, very simple conceit. It's not even like it hasn't been done before, like similar things have been done before. But it was a fun little idea that I had originally for a one-shot, really. But then I'm like, there's probably a bit too much to that. We should have like a campaign around that. And then I built the world just to serve that one little story, and that became the plot of Bainesbreak. And yeah, so I immediately sat down and I got an incarnate, and I did the whole world, the whole map by hand, which looked like dog shit, but it worked. I eventually paid someone to do a proper map, which I have it hanging in my dining room. It looks lovely. But then, yeah, it was like, okay, great. So what are all the cultures that live here? Specifically starting with like, what will the story primarily interact with? Like who will the players primarily touch upon? Let's make sure that those are the best fleshed out. But then just inherently, I can't help but go down the rabbit hole of, well, now that I've established this thing implies 6 other things. So I want to flesh those out. But now each of those implies 6 new things on each of them. So you snowball down, or now I've got, I think it's a 500 plus page document just breaking down essential lore. And that's just essential lore. There's a lot more stuff that's like an entire major historical event or an entire culture is listed as a single sentence in that document, or there's entire just reams of culture and history and data and information and tradition that I have still in my head that I have not written down yet. So yeah, I guess to answer the question long-windedly is, I'm very much a macro world builder. It's the whole kit and caboodle in one giant chunk that then only grows larger with time.
Mm-hmm. World building's a hell of a drug, right?
Oh yeah. It's great. I've had a blast.
Okay, well, we could wander down that one too, but we have to keep moving. So yeah, that kind of brings us to the end of the topic, but there is a question that I ask everybody who comes on the show. It's kind of the question that lives at the heart of this little social experiment. And that question is, in my opinion, there exists a space at the corner of story and game, but it's the intersection of performance, screenwriting, music, magic, comedy, all these things where all these people can come together, just hang out. There's a shared language, kind of a shared community that just naturally exists. In your opinion, what is the magical thread that would hold such a place together?
That is a fascinating question. Yeah, because it really cuts at the heart of because I've always been of the philosophy that all of these subjects, like you said, they intersect in such powerful ways, and they really all align around this concept of the most broad, most basic idea of aesthetics. Like what is art? What is beauty? And why does it exist? How does it communicate so powerfully? And yeah, if I was to say one thing, one word, one subject that I think really ties this all together, and I will also I'll provide a little bit of context to that as well, is I think the thing that really brings all of this together is community. And the reason for that is, when you look at any artistic endeavor, whether it's literally fine arts, comedy, screenwriting, prose, TTRPGs, actual plays, music, whatever, these have always been used throughout the history of humanity to bring groups of humans closer together, to share stories, to share traditions, which then inherently bonds us tighter as a people, as a race of individuals, and allows us to carry forward a consistent and a cohesive view of who we are, why we exist, and what we represent. It's a way in which we engender community. We engender kind of that, people use the word, obviously, tribalism as a bad term, and it certainly does have a lot of bad connotations, but the idea that humanity is essentially fundamentally social creature, and that our focus is how do we coexist as a pack, as a tribe? And I feel like the glue that holds all of that together is the aesthetic, is the story, is the art. It's the way that we give our time together and our time on this earth meaning. They say that, art decorates space, music decorates time. I feel that all of these various forms of aesthetics each bring beauty and decoration to a dimension of living, a dimension of space, of time, of what have you, that all comes together to give this whole thing a point. And that point is the fact that we're in it together. But that's just my 2-second breakdown. But I feel like that's really what cuts at the heart of it for me. That's why I do a lot of what I do.
Dude, that's brilliant. That is fantastic. Like I said, you're hella smart.
And you're hella kind.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the serious questions. I got little quick fires that I like to do before we head out the door, just to get to know Vince a little better.
Oh, sure.
What are you currently playing?
Currently playing, oh my God, I'm trying to get to the end of a playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3, which I tragically have so little time for video games that I play them in very, over a very protracted duration. So myself and my girlfriend have been working through a playthrough of BG3 for now some months, but we're finally in Act 3. I have to go rescue Duke Ravengard, and I've been putting it off. I think Halsin's dead, so we'll see how that goes.
Right. Okay, what are you reading?
Right now, reading Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy.
All right, here's a new one. I haven't asked this one yet to anybody, so it's just for you. If your essence was perfectly translated into a tabletop role-playing game, what race and class would you be?
Oh my God. Okay. So I'm going to give a little bit of a cheap answer. So the way that I built my world, obviously it imported a lot of ideas, a lot of the philosophies from D&D into it that I've then, retuned, reskinned. And even now I'm continuing to massively change because I'm now doing new things with the world that are divorced even from D&D. So you want to really differentiate yourself. But for me, one of my favorite cultures that I developed in that world was that of my version of the Tabaxi. And the way their philosophies, the way they engage with the world around them, the very sort of ecological style of living they employ, the types of magic that they use in their philosophies on it. So I'd be a kitty, I suppose. And in terms of class, that's fascinating. Yeah, what's the most me? I'm really not that. I'm not the fighter. I'm not really that guy. I think it'd have to be. Wow. You wouldn't think that question would be so difficult to answer, actually. There's almost too many options. I'm feeling I'd probably be in the vein of either a druid or I think a druid or sorcerer. Someone basically in both cases where you have a degree of magical innate to you and can choose to evoke it in ways that are not beholden to a deity or entity. But then sort of the way that you want to go about that, it'd be one of those two for me, I think.
Multi-class.
There you go. And one little dip of rogue.
There you go. And a touch of bard. And all right, last one. If you could host a game session with any 4 people, living or dead, from any time in human history, who would they be and what would you play? This is why I sent you the questions ahead of time, brother.
This is fantastic. I love letting myself be surprised by it.
There you go.
Okay, here's what I would do. Let's see. Edgar Allan Poe, Agatha Christie, Tolkien for flavor, because I think he'd honestly be kind of a chore. And let's see. 4th player. Oh, who would be interesting? And Mel Blanc. And I'd run them through 10 candles. Just kill them all.
I would watch that. That'd be fantastic.
Because I feel like Poe brings that macabre kind of styling a little bit. Agatha Christie is so such a pioneer of mystery and death. But then you have Mel Blanc, just wacky as fuck.
Throwing out
and
voices.
Tolkien is probably taking it way too seriously.
Can you imagine his session 0 notes? He shows up with 24 pages of handwritten.
The most laborious thing ever.
All right, buddy. That's the questions. We're going to start heading out the door. Before we go, though, I like to have a little space where if there's something you're working on, something you've made in the past you want to promote or boost, or where people can find you, this is the spot. So what are you up to and where can we find you?
Yeah, so a lot of what I'm working on right now is very much like in progress. I'm working on a novel. I'm working on multiple screenplays and short films right now, but they're all very much like in media res. So I'd say the best way to stay tuned to get an idea of what I'm up to, what I'm doing, is just find me on socials. For me, that's mostly Instagram, Threads, Twitter, all the usuals. It's just at Vince Caso on all of them. Any social platform, you'll find me there. And yeah, I'll always post updates on what I'm doing, what I'm up to, what's new, what's dropping. And hopefully we'll have some interesting stuff to share with you all before too long this year. So stay tuned.
Right on. Well, hey, man, we're going to head out the door here. But before I turn down the fire and put up the chairs, I'd love to give you the last word. So any parting words of wisdom?
Parting words of wisdom. Okay. I'd say all y'all out there, if I can send a message to just one group of people, of all those who might be listening to this, if you are too nervous or unsure about whether or not you have what it takes to start playing, whether or not you're good enough to start playing, good enough to put your content out there for others to view, or even just to play at a home game, recognize that the only wrong way to play this game is to not have fun. It doesn't matter if you're engaged in, like I said earlier, high mechanics, low mechanics, high role play, or low role play. Get out there, tell your stories, find the people who you do relate to, who play the way that you play, or even who might, take you just a tiny bit outside of your comfort zone if you want to try something new, and realize that there's no such thing as being bad at this game. There is only not having a good time or not playing with your table. As long as you're all just involved in this together, inclusive, and telling a story cooperatively, you're playing it right. So there's no barrier to entry. There's no skill minimum. Just have a good time, man. We're all just playing games. I know my whole talk today has been so very in-depth and a lot of the deeper philosophy and skills employed at a high level of showmanship for streamed games. It doesn't take any of that. You don't need any of it. Just start playing and you'll have a great time.
Well, it's getting late and my bed's calling. I sure hope it's not a mimic. But thank you to Vince for joining us and sharing your insights into the intersection of acting, gaming, and storytelling. You've offered us invaluable perspectives for live-action gaming and for the narrative enthusiasts alike. And to you, dear listener, thank you for joining us and taking a spot at the table. May you continue exploring, creating, and sharing your stories with the world. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the Corner of Story and Game.